three important ways, the history of silver is at an inflection point. While the study of material culture has expanded to include greater attention to colonial perspectives, the study of silver has been slower to tackle these complex approaches. My paper today seeks to bridge silver studies with the methodologies preferred by Caribbean and Black studies scholars, methods that center the experiences of those marginalized by the economies of empire. But before diving into my research, it's imperative to acknowledge that my research on silver in 18th century Jamaica would not be possible if it was not for the contributions of historians and institutions in Jamaica who have worked to ensure the preservation of Jamaica's material culture. The excellent research of the Jamaican scholar Robert Barker, who dedicated his career to researching the makers and stylistic characteristics of colonial Jamaican silver, is foundational to any study of the history of silver production and silversmiths in 18th century Jamaica. During his career, Barker published two key articles on silversmiths in early colonial Jamaica. His article, Jamaican Goldsmiths, Assayers and Their Marks from 1665 to 1765, published in the Silver Society Journal in 1986, made a case for the reattribution of a collection of 18th century silver believed to have made in Aberdeen, Scotland. By thoroughly examining the maker and assayer mark branded on each silver object, Barker rightly argued that the collection was made by the hands of 18th century silversmiths in Jamaica, and that the mark was evidence of his heir in Jamaica by the name of Anthony Danvers. The contributions of Barker and Jamaica's cultural institutions in preserving, collecting, and advocating for the care of Jamaica's decorative arts has laid the groundwork for future research on Jamaica's material culture, including my paper today. Yet while historians and cultural institutions in Jamaica have begun the important work of studying silver, the study of silver in 18th century Jamaica, both locally made and imported, is still in its infancy. It wasn't until I examined Robert Barker's collection of 18th century Jamaican silver at the National Museum of Scotland, a study trip generously made possible by the Silver Society, that I was able to examine a range of silver objects made in Jamaica during the 18th century. While early colonial Jamaican objects have been scattered across the Atlantic Basin or destroyed owing to revolt, fire, and natural disaster, Barker reassembled and preserved Jamaica's colonial silver tradition through his collecting practice. The collection is remarkable and rich in scope. Barker's collection of silver includes over 50 objects made in 18th century Jamaica, from a kettle to candlesticks, silver waiters, teaspoons, ladles, and sugar bowls. It includes a stand, a pair of silver waiters, and tablespoons made by the workshop of Ephraim Crow during the 1750s to 60s, a punch ladle made in the 1750s by the workshop of Ephraim Crow, a silver salt made in the 1760s by the workshop of James Turner, and a cup made by the workshop of William Duncan around the year 1750. There is a bowl and a pair of waiters made by the workshop of Allen and Campbell around the 1740s, as well as a marrow scoop and silver moat spoon made by the workshop of Andrew Charles Williamson around 1759. Robert Barker's collection also includes objects made during the 1750s and 60s, which feature the mark of Anthony Danvers. Objects include a silver handbell, a stand, a sugar bowl, and a waiter, as well as a collection of tablespoons. A cream jug was crafted by the workshop of Charles Allen around 1745, as well as silver waiters, a ladle, and assortment of tablespoons throughout the 1740s to 60s. Around the year 1747, the workshop of Charles Wood produced a pair of waiters. And in 1770, the workshop of George Clinton made a tablespoon. The collection also includes a silver salt and spoon made in the 1750s by the workshop of George Hetherington. And also included in the collection are two ladles made by the workshop of John Roxenberg around 1780. Silver crafted by the workshop of Gerardus Stoutenberg is also included in Robert Barker's collection. The collection includes a pair of candlesticks and 4 tablespoons made around the 1750s to 60s by that workshop. Lastly, the work of the workshop of Solomon Saldana is represented in the collection. The collection includes a sugar bowl made between 1750 and 60, and a kettle made during the 1750s, both objects made by the workshop of Saldana. My paper today takes Robert Barker's collection as a foundation for thinking through the complex relationship between silver and the Black experience in 18th century Jamaica. My paper today is a work in progress paper in which I share my current thoughts about the relationship between silver and the Black experience in 18th century Jamaica. I am particularly interested in the consumption of silver, silver's sensorial properties, and what the reflective and sonic properties of silver reveal about the Black experience in Jamaica's 18th century urban landscape. Silver objects were among the very few objects that allowed enslaved domestic laborers to see and consider their image. How did enslaved domestic laborers see their reflection within silver objects displayed in an urban townhouse? What sounds of silver did enslaved and free Jamaicans hear in the streets of Kingston? How did they make sense of these sounds? What inherited West African practices surrounding silver were brought to Jamaica? What practices were learned by Jamaican-born enslaved and freed communities? And how did the varied inherited and learned cultural practices surrounding silver foster multiple and infinitely varied encounters with silver by Jamaica's Black community in the 18th century? I explore these questions surrounding silver and the multiplicities of the Black experience through a series of historically grounded and evidence-driven narratives about the lives of 3 historical actors who lived in Kingston, Jamaica between the 1740s and 60s. The historical actors that drive these narratives are Phoeba, an enslaved female domestic laborer, Ben, an enslaved silversmith with a disability in the workshop of the goldsmith Solomon Saldana, and Caesar Cross, a freed Black man and consumer of silver objects. Phoeba, Ben, and Caesar Cross emerge within the historical record through 18th century wills held at the Island Record Office in Spanish Town, Jamaica, and through probate inventories held in the Jamaica Archives and National Archives Kew. As made evident by surviving wills and inventories, Phoeba, Ben, and Caesar Cross were very real people who lived in the urban center of Kingston during the mid-18th century. Through an act of care, Phoeba's freed sister, Cecilia Mayo, preserved Phoeba's name in her last will and testament and recorded the name of her enslaver, Captain Thomas Pitts. Upon his death in 1767, the property and estate of the goldsmith Solomon Saldana was appraised. In the probate inventory were 7 enslaved people, including a man named Ben, described as, quote, crippled from the rheumatism. Rheumatic disease today refers to conditions that impact the joints, tendons, bones, and muscles, such as arthritis. In writing his last will and testament in 1745 was Caesar Cross, a free Black slaveholder who owned property in Kingston. Cross bequeathed a silver watch, silver knee and shoe buckles, and gold sleeve buttons to the freed Black Jamaican Robert Pope. In doing so, Cross sought to retain wealth in silver within Jamaica's Black community. During the 18th century, Kingston had developed into one of the wealthiest commercial centers in the British Americas, surpassing northern towns such as Boston and Philadelphia, principally owing to the town's immense involvement in the transatlantic slave trade and the development of the island's sugar economy. As historians Trevor Bernard, Higman, and Christine Walker have all well demonstrated, by mid-century, Kingston boasted the largest urban community of freed and enslaved people of African descent in the British Americas. By 1774, Kingston's Black community encompassed over 9,000 people, and by 1788, the enslaved community in Kingston formed 62.9% of Kingston's total population. While Kingston's enslaved and freed Black community were a dominant part of Jamaica's urban community, their histories often remain untold in decorative arts scholarship. Writing histories of Jamaica's 18th century enslaved and freed Black communities necessitates an encounter with Jamaica's archive of buildings, archaeological fragments, objects, and historical documents. It is an archive that spans multiple geographical locations, including Jamaica, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And it is an archive that has been continually wrecked by earthquake, fire, revolt, heat, and hurricane. It is an archive that privileges the lives of Jamaica's elite planters and wealthy merchants who earned their fortunes through the slave trade. It is an archive that sought to render invisible the histories, agency, and perspectives of enslaved and freed Black Jamaicans. But the lack of written historical documentation left behind by Phoeba, Ben, and Caesar Cross doesn't mean that their experiences shouldn't be told. Rather, writing about the lives of Phoeba, Ben, and Caesar Cross necessitates new approaches to the writing of history. In the wake of so much violence, fragmentation, and deterioration, my research engages an experimental approach to the study of silver and the Black experience. I draw upon methodological approaches put forward by American and Caribbean Black Studies scholars Marissa Fuentes, Sadia Hartman, Tia Miles, and Krista Thompson, in order to subvert the historical documents that do survive and reconstitute the ways enslaved and free Black Jamaicans engage silver in urban landscapes. Throughout this project, my writing practice has also been inspired by contemporary authors across the Black diaspora. I draw upon the writing practices of historically situated authors such as Toni Morrison, Octavia Butler, Andrea Levy, and Eleanor Shearer, who engage creative writing practices in historical fiction as a method to imagine, speculate, humanize, and render visible histories of the Black experience in the absence of archival documentation. Following the lead of historically grounded authors, I engage storytelling in this paper as a writing practice with the goal of opening up new space for insights about the relationship between silver and the Black experience. In the following narratives, I analyze 18th century silver objects, Black makers and consumers, and surviving archival sources, such as travel accounts, journals, letters, diaries, newspapers, towns plans, land records, probate inventories, and wills, through the framework of historical imagination. In doing so, this paper is composed of historically speculated moments about the lives of Phoeba, Ben, and Caesar Cross that offer new insight into histories of silver and the Black experience in Jamaica's 18th century urban landscape. The narratives of Phoeba, Ben, and Caesar Cross that unfold over the following pages are not a definitive history. Rather, they are one historically defendable representation from among the endless possibilities of their daily lives. Captain Thomas Pitts cared about his public appearance and the upkeep of his house in Kingston, Jamaica. Perhaps coming from a family in England with no inherited wealth, Pitts's engagement in slavery and smuggling within the Caribbean earned him a fortune. His new wealth permitted him to become a social elite in Kingston, and he likely desired to exhibit his newly acquired status to guests, family, and business partners. One way to showcase his newfound social status was to require his enslaved domestic laborer Phoeba to polish the silver on a regular basis. In Jamaica's slave society, where white inhabitants valued and upheld notions of refinement and beauty in art and mannerisms, the tarnishing of silver undermined claims to genteel refinement. To allow oxidization, or in other words, to let silver blacken, evoked contemporary 18th century debates surrounding slavery and the emerging racialized view that whiteness was superior to Blackness. As the obsessive act of polishing of silver in the 18th century insinuates, silver was only beautiful in its polished, glistening form. Blackened silver, on the other hand, was not suitable for display. So Phoeba polished the silver. Captain Thomas Pitts kept his most valued possessions in his private quarters. To polish the silver, Phoeba, an enslaved laborer, had to enter the bedchamber where his silver was stored. An old silver-gilded sword hung in the corner of the bedchamber. Adjacent to the wooden bedstead, neatly made with linen sheets and draped with a mosquito net, was the gold-headed cane he maybe used each day. Maybe it leaned against his worn dressing table where he kept his shaving cloth. To the left side of the room was the mahogany bookcase fashioned with glass doors, where Pitts might have exhibited his collection of printed books and flutes. Tucked into the corner of the bookshelf were likely 3 painted snuff boxes and a gold ring that he likely held dear. The old spying glass that Pitts usually displayed on the 3rd shelf of his bookcase was missing. It unnerved Phoeba. Tactfully maneuvering through the bedchamber, Phoeba approached the silver wash basin. Among the silver objects stored in Pitts's room were a punch basin, salt cellars, 6 spoons, a soup spoon, a punch ladle, teaspoons, and silver knee buckles. Approaching the silver wash basin, Phoeba noticed fingerprint marks stained on the side of the basin owing to its routine use. She removed the cloth napkin she carried in the pocket of her white petticoat and polished the walls of the basin. Her fingers, protected by the cloth to be sure not to smudge her prints, moved around the rim of the bowl. Slowly and carefully rotating the bowl, Phoeba likely observed the mark of the maker stamped onto the rim of the basin, 2 initials, SS. Phoeba understood the hallmark. Staring into the side of the wash basin, Phoeba's eyes glared back to her. Her face reflected into the surface of the wash basin. Her image was distorted, but she recognized her warped likeness. The wide reflective surface of the wash basin had metamorphosized into a makeshift mirror. Maybe Phoeba gently pulled down the sleeve of her Osnaburg dress to expose the mark branded on her right shoulder. Looking into the silver wash basin, her eyes fixated on the reflection of the mark branded on her own body. On Phoeba's right shoulder was the mark of 2 initials, TP. It was a hallmark emblazoned onto her skin from a silver stamp that identified her as the property of Thomas Pitts. The silver wash basin was branded, and so too was Phoeba. Phoeba glanced to the side of the bedchamber and saw the branding stamp labeled TP, a stamp that had caused her so much pain, resting on a table. Did Phoeba tremble at the sight of her branding? Did she want to destroy this reminder of her enslavement and smash the elite silver wash basin into the walls that held up the house? Would she melt the silver in a kitchen fire and transform it into a weapon to avenge her captive body?
Did Phoebe daydream about letting the fire continue to smoke, running away with the silver and leaving the bedchambers in flames? Would seeing her reflection in the underside of a silver wash basin leave Phoebe through rage to resistance? But if Phoebe Day destroyed the silver, she could be charged for theft and sentenced to jail in Kingston. Would destroying the silver cause her even more harm? Or maybe Phoebe wished to clean the silver. Maybe it was the only opportunity she had to see her reflection in the underside of the wash basin. Maybe it was the moment for her to be seen, to center herself. Maybe Phoebe's daydreaming of burning down the townhouse broke at the sound of a bell. At the sound, she might have tightened her grip around the silver, stood up, and unwrinkled her petticoat. It was not the sound of the silver handbell that Captain Thomas Pitts chimed when he desired to Phoebe to take up a new task. It couldn't be. Captain Thomas Pitts, a mariner in the South Sea Company, was commanding a ship to South America with Edward Manning. Maybe Phoebe passed the mosquito-netted bedstead as she followed the ethereal sound to the jalousie window. Outside were the sand streets of Kingston. Phoebe peered through the window slates, but did not see the individual nor the instrument which produced the chime. Yet the delicate sound reverberated throughout the street. Its sound carrying over the slated roofs of timber frame buildings and engulfing the air of the street dense like a fog rolling over the peaks of the Blue Mountains. The sound hastily entered the windows of the bedchamber. Despite the invisibility of the sound, Phoebe knew what it signaled. There was no escaping the suffocating resonance of the ring of this specific handbell as it chimed on cue every morning, like the 8-day mahogany clock that stood in the hall of Pitts's townhouse. Turning the corner and emerging through the crowded street was a young boy ringing the culprit of the instrument that generated the noise. The young boy held a paper containing the number of enslaved peoples to be sold at market that day. As the boy traversed the streets of Kingston ringing the bell, he shared the news of that day's slave sale. Enslavers heard the sound of the bell and made their way to the slave market at the intended time of sale. As Phoebe peered through the window from the second floor of the townhouse, she witnessed the sale of humans as thousands of recently enslaved Africans, men, women, and children made their way from slave ships to merchant houses, where they were usually contained in the house's basement or to be sold in the house's rear courtyard. Phoebe would have witnessed enslaved Africans being led from the waterfront and through the streets of Kingston, nude, barefoot, bound in iron shackles, and with a card around their necks, as they walked to the slave auction, leading their fleeting footprints in the sand streets of Kingston. Leaving his quarters one Friday morning, Ben walked towards Temple Lane and stepped foot onto the wide and unpaved Harbor Street. The loose sand grains of the street gusted through the air as the ocean breeze swept across the streets. While cities around the Atlantic, such as London and Charleston, had begun to integrate cobbled paved streets, Kingston had not. Ben placed one foot in front of the other as his feet touched the earth. As he walked, his footprints became imprinted into the sand. And for a transient moment, a part of Ben, his footprints, marked the street until an ocean wind or the drench of a rainstorm washed them away. The early morning streets of Kingston were crowded. Merchants opened their stores for business, enslaved cabinet makers carried logwood and mahogany into furniture workshops, and travelers approached Harbor Street from lodgings operated by free Black women. Wealthy planters dressed in white felt hats, fine silk, and pleated coats rode into Kingston on 2-horse coaches to visit their warehouses. Enslaved female vendors arrived in Kingston after a long trek along the bog walk. The women carefully placed woven baskets of produce on their heads, supported by a cotta, as they made their way into the street to sell vegetables, pottery made with African craft practices, and fresh ackee. The trotting sounds of horse hooves, the rattle of carriage wheels turning, and the loud babble of African and European languages carried throughout the clear air. Within the ruckus of morning activities, Ben also heard the chime of the bell rung by the young boy. He shuddered. It was not like the energetic clank of the West African bells Ben knew from West Africa. Rather, the sound was delicate. Its softness scorched his mind. The sound of the handbell might have reminded Ben of his relationship with metalwork as an enslaved silversmith. A relationship that was simultaneously loving, fruitful, poignant, and tragically scarred. Ben may have born in West Africa, captured from his town, and sold into slavery in exchange for a brass bracelet or glass bead. Ben's passion for metalwork was weaponized against him. The types of bronze metal bracelets he once crafted and sold as a metalsmith in perhaps Benin or Ghana were now a catalyst of his enslavement. Bound into a wooden coffle or an iron chain, Ben likely marched from his town to Cape Coast Castle, the largest British trading post for enslaved Africans located on the coast of Ghana. Here, Ben's relationship with metalwork haunted him. Here, Ben was held in an underground dungeon sealed by an iron gate. Here, Ben sat in a room suffocated by the continuous rattling of iron chains and its lingering echoes against the cellar walls. Here, time was routinely marked by the sound of a bell that rang throughout the castle. Now, in Jamaica during the 1740s, the memories of Cape Coast Castle likely lived on in Ben's mind and body. His bodily trauma response to the sound of the bell in Kingston was perhaps to tremor. Or maybe Ben blocked the scarring memory from his mind. Maybe Ben sought to escape the sound of the bell and run down Temple Lane to the workshop of his enslaver, Solomon Saldanha. Saldanha was a goldsmith, possibly of Jewish descent, who established a workshop in Kingston. On the docket of objects to craft that day was perhaps a silver teapot for Mary Stevens. Mary Stevens, the wife of Walton Stevens in Kingston, had recently inherited a collection of plates from her aunt Mary Eldridge, who had owned the plantation Spring Estate in the parish of St. Andrew and enslaved 102 people of African descent. Having inherited all of her aunt's plate in 1745, maybe Mary Stevens sought to recast an old silver teapot into a teapot of the latest Rococo fashion. As silver workshops often had a standard inventory of patterns and designs, maybe the teapot would look similar to the teapot on the screen made by the workshop of Solomon Saldanha in the 1750s. By the time Ben entered the workshop, Jemmy, an enslaved laborer enslaved by Solomon Saldanha, had already grasped the bellow and pressed air into the fire. The kindling fire awakened into flames. Ben sat at a bench by the window, strained to pick up the old hammer with a steady hand to prevent the tool from striking his feet, and began pounding the backside of the silver sheet in order to form the bulbous shape of a teapot. Across the workshop, Jemmy poured liquid silver into a tablespoon mold. Others melted down old coins and candlesticks in the billowing fire and hammered softened metal into sheets to later shape into waiters or candlesticks. While Ben was equipped to shape the silver plate into the form of a silver teapot, Ben was also highly skilled at embossing the surface of silver objects. Yet the practice of embossing proved more difficult each day as Ben grappled with his developing rheumatism. Over the previous weeks, Ben noticed the joints in his fingers had begun to swell, throb, and become inflamed each morning. His inflammation grew worse over the weeks. Some days, Ben's hands were so stiff from the inflammation that he could not bend his fingers to grab hold of a hammer or tool. The flaring inflammation and joint pain of rheumatism impacted his ability to work. Yet, as an enslaved Black man who was legally rendered as property rather than as a person, Ben was forced to labor despite his growing disability. Maybe Ben confided in Jemmy about his rheumatism. Maybe Ben and Jemmy shared the work as a way to help alleviate his physical pain. Maybe Jemmy copied the design patterns held in the silver workshop to embellish the silver teapot with fashionable Rococo botanical designs. Maybe Jemmy had embossed the flowers blossoming around the side of the teapot, while Ben sculpted the finial in the image of an acorn and spout in the guise of a scaled sea creature, and included the bust of a human figure on the teapot handle. Being able to accomplish the high level of decorative work with a disability meant that Ben likely had highly specialized skill in metalwork. Laboring in the workshop of Solomon Saldanha might not have been his first encounter with metalwork. Maybe Ben was a metalsmith in the Empire of Asante, now present-day Ghana. As an Asante craftsman, Ben would have experienced crafting round Kuroa vessels made from copper and brass. These vessels, meant to hold valuables and ointments, were decorated with details made through practices of repoussé. Or maybe Ben was a metalsmith in the Kingdom of Benin, a region of West Africa well known for the production of elaborate bronze sculpture. Ben's expertise in working bronze metals into intricate sculptures perhaps transferred to the formation of a silver teapot's figural handle and animalistic spout. Intricate sculptural work that would have undeniably rendered upon previous training in metalsmithing and sculpture. While Ben's engagement with metals was a valuable asset to the goldsmith Solomon Saldanha, his developing disability was not. It is likely that Ben sought to resist slavery and perhaps treat his disability through his engagement with metals. As an enslaved silversmith, maybe Ben spent his Sundays selling metal bracelets at the Sunday market, a market held by Jamaica's enslaved and freed Black community every Sunday. Walking the market one Sunday afternoon, Ben would have likely been joined by thousands of enslaved men, women, families traveling to Kingston by foot and mule from across the mountainous island to participate in the market. It was an opportunity to exchange produce such as potatoes, yams, banana, cocoa, and herbs, and to converse with community members about the latest news on the island surrounding revolt. At the Sunday market, enslaved and freed Black women dressed in white gowns and matching hats unloaded their produce and wares, while enslaved and freed men conversed over a glass of rum and water. It is possible Ben arrived at the Sunday market with an intent to create a secondhand market in silver in hope of earning an income to purchase his own freedom. Maybe Ben drew upon his training in West African metalwork and reworked brass scraps or stolen silver teaspoons into bracelets of West African traditions to be sold or traded among Jamaica's Black community. It is also probable that Ben crafted and sold silver bracelets in hope of earning an income he needed to purchase herbs to help treat the swelling of his joints and the stiffness of his fingers. If left untreated, rheumatism could cause carpal tunnel syndrome, widespread inflammation of his lungs, joint damage, and cardiovascular diseases that could put him at risk for stroke and heart attack. The amassing of specialized silversmithing skills, both European practices and familiar West African traditions in metalwork, likely enabled Ben to become a sophisticated and valued silversmith in Kingston, but it also did so at a cost that would greatly impact his own health. It was 10 o'clock when Caesar Cross walked Harbor Street and passed the store of Mr. Hotham. Hotham's store was a two-story timber frame building like many of the other stores fronting Harbor Street. Mr. Hotham lived upstairs on the upper floor overhanging Harbor Street, and he kept the store on the ground floor. Peering through a large glass store window, Cross saw a young enslaved boy sweeping the store floor and three white gentlemen dressed in linen waistcoats browsing a selection of gold watches. Turning down Duke Street, maybe a two-horse-driven coach transporting two white women passed by as he walked the street. The women wore expensive silk gowns with frivolous blue and green feathers in their hair. Their cheery eyes aglow and faces blushed. Perhaps they spent the journey gossiping over who attended last night's ball at the King's house in Spanish Town. Seated behind the two women was an enslaved Black servant wearing white attire and knee bands with gold buckles. He held an umbrella over the women to protect their rosy faces from turning a charred red. Maybe Caesar Cross strove to fit in with the privileged and money-hungry elites of Duke Street. Living in Kingston, Cross would have routinely seen the elite houses of merchants plotted along the town's rigid grid plan. Some houses were fenced in by brick and iron fences. Peering through the bars of the fence, one might see a winding grand staircase rising from the garden to the main entrance, or a piazza wrapping around the building. Walking against the backdrop of gated brick houses, Cross, a free Black Jamaican and slaveholder, wore his shiny silver shoe buckles, a silver watch, and gold sleeve buttons. The shine of his silver refracting underneath the bright Caribbean sun and made visible to those on the street. Cross likely adopted the fashion of the white elite, including silver objects, in order to advance his own social status in a white masculine urban landscape. Maybe he sought to accommodate to resist. Caesar Cross was not the only freed Black Jamaican who strove to advance his social status through the consumption and display of silver objects. As 18th century Jamaican probate inventories evidence, freed Black men and women across Jamaica purchased and consumed silver. John Selvin, a doctor and slaveholder, enslaved 7 people and owned 1 pair of old silver shoe buckles and knee buckles at the time of his death in 1770. Robert Wilson, a freed Black Jamaican slaveholder in the parish of St. Catherine, had kept a gold ring, silver spoons, and 1 pair of silver shoe buckles in a chest in his house. Mary Richardson, a free Black woman and slaveholder also in the parish of St. Catherine, owned a dressing glass, teaspoons, and some old gold by the time of her death in 1741. Michael Roberts, a freed Black Jamaican living in the parish of St. Dorothy, owned a silver watch, 2 dozen silver buckles and knee buckles, candlesticks, and an old gun by the time of his death in 1744. And in the city of Kingston, Mary Hanson, a freed Black woman, owned 1 gold ring by the time of her death in 1737. And upon her death in 1764, the property and estate of Anne Jennison, a freed Black woman in Kingston, was appraised. In her inventory were a range of fine furnishings, such as mahogany card tables, a large looking glass, a large mahogany dining table, blue and white china dishes, as well as 12 enslaved peoples, and a range of silver objects, such as silver milk jars, candlesticks, silver cups, silver mugs, gold shoe buckles, and silver buttons. And perhaps one of the most exuberant freed Black Jamaican consumers was Francis Williams, a Black Jamaican poet and scholar who studied Latin and mathematics in England in the 1710s. Williams returned to Jamaica in 1724 and later established a school in Spanish Town. Around the year 1740, an identified artist painted an oil portrait of Francis Williams. In the portrait, Williams gestures his right hand towards a series of books written by enlightened thinkers John Locke and Isaac Newton, which are neatly stored on his wooden bookcase. Williams rests his left hand on a page of Newton's philosophy. As a scholar and poet who worked as a tutor in Spanish Town, the portrait signals that Williams not only possessed the knowledge and literature necessary to teach Newton's philosophy, but he also possessed the related teaching equipment, such as feathered quills and a silver inkstand, a drawing compass, mathematical tools, and a celestial globe. The substantial collection of gilded books, tools, and the quilled writing utensil signals the scholar's prominent position as an intellect in Jamaican society. Yet the portrait communicates more than Williams's intellectual edification. The objects rendered in the portrait represent Williams as an active consumer engaged in the emerging 18th century Atlantic market. In the portrait, Williams wears a gray powdered wig, his blue coat is well fitted to his shoulders, he wears a silky gray waistcoat securely fastened by gold buttons, and he wears a linen neckcloth. The sleeves of his shirt are embellished with white ruffles, and silver shoe buckles are fastened to his shiny black shoes. With a large free Black population, the appearance of Williams maybe not had caused such a stir to those in Jamaica. The appearance of Francis Williams and Caesar Cross was not very different from those of their white counterparts. But while Francis Williams was Jamaican-born, and if Caesar Cross was born in Africa, it is likely that Caesar Cross would have known the distinction from elites in Africa, who often wore silver button waistcoats, maybe with African beads, from the appearance of elites in Jamaica. Maybe Cross understood silver objects and the way silver performed within Jamaican society in a different way from Francis Williams. As European objects flowed into the ports of West Africa throughout the 18th century, luxury objects often traded for enslaved peoples, Efik chiefs in West Africa purchased and consumed European luxury goods. The Efik elite engaged luxury objects in the self-fashioning of their image. As a young child or an adult, maybe Caesar Cross saw the West African elite dressed in silver shoe buckles and a red waistcoat lined with silver buttons. Maybe Caesar Cross understood silver to operate differently among the Black kings of West Africa and the elite white planters and merchants of Jamaica. Beyond the sight of enslaved Africans bound together by iron chains, Caesar Cross witnessed Black bodies adorned in silver in West Africa. He witnessed Black kings in West Africa self-fashion their identities and construct their own notions of Blackness through the consumption of silver. Considering this possible reality, how might Caesar Cross have understood his own consumption and display of silver in 18th century Jamaica? Did Cross seek to accommodate to resist? Perhaps Caesar Cross enhanced his social position as a Black man in Jamaica by dressing in a manner visually legible to elite European merchants and planters. Or maybe Caesar Cross drew upon his understanding of Black kingship and the elites in West Africa. Rather than dressing in a manner of Jamaica's white elites, it is possible that Caesar Cross engaged silver to present himself to Jamaican society in the image of a free Black king. As the consumption and production of silver among enslaved and freed Black communities in 18th century Jamaica unveils, silver in 18th century Jamaica was a means to render visible Blackness. As Phoebe washed the silver basin, she saw her warped reflection in the hallmark of her enslavement. As Phoebe and Ben heard the delicate sound of a bell ring throughout the streets of Kingston, the traumas they withstood resurfaced in their minds. By crafting and selling West African bracelets at the Sunday market, maybe Ben saved enough money to purchase his own freedom or cure his rheumatism. And Caesar Cross, a freed Black Jamaican, wore silver watches and shoe buckles and perhaps drew upon his understanding of the material culture of West African elites to fashion his own image as a freed man within Jamaica's slave society. As moments in the lives of Phoebe, Ben, and Caesar Cross become realized and reconstituted through the study of silver, it is imperative to remember that these moments are critically fabulated. There are no known letters or diaries left behind by Phoebe, Ben, and Caesar Cross that will tell us explicitly how Jamaica's freed and enslaved Black communities engaged with silver in the 18th century. Yet that does not mean that the stories of Phoebe, Ben, and Caesar Cross are not worth telling. While these narratives are speculated, these narratives behold a certain layer of truth. Writing his last will and testament in 1745, the freed Black Jamaican Caesar Cross would go on to bequeath his silver shoe buckles and silver watch to a fellow freed Black Jamaican named Robert Pope. Pope inherited a silver collection that would one day adorn his Black body. The bequeathal of silver among Jamaica's Black community was the bequeathal of freedom and wealth among a dynasty of Black Jamaicans. It is a slither of evidence in the historical archive that renders visible the overwhelming importance of silver to the Black community in 18th century Jamaica. Thank you.
Well done, Catherine. Thank you very much. So, any questions? Yes, Ben, right over there. It's good exercise.
I just want to ask you whether or not the workshops, those were made in Jamaican workshops, I take it. Okay. Do you know if they had any list of African Jamaicans within those workshops?
So, yeah, on the probate inventory of Solomon Saldana that I
Yes.
have, who's a goldsmith in Jamaica, in his inventory at the end are a list of enslaved peoples within the workshop or house. And so that's where I found the name of Ben was listed on there,
Okay.
as well as the name of Jemmy, and so they would have been of African descent, yes.
Right, okay, thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. That was great. This sort of follows on. I know in some of the other Caribbean nations, some of the free black or coloured people set up their own businesses as silversmiths. Did you find any evidence in the Jamaican silversmiths of free blacks or coloured people running their own business?
I haven't found an inventory or evidence of that yet. That doesn't mean that doesn't exist somewhere. The unfortunate thing about some of my research last semester was that the Jamaica archives were closed, and so that's where a list of a lot of these probate inventories are. And so because of that, my research on this facet has been a bit slower, but yeah, I'm sure there definitely were freed Jamaicans who were operating silver shops. It's just a matter of finding that, yeah.
Anybody else? Yes.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting and powerful. I was wondering, is there any evidence of a sort of personal, like African influence within silver from that period?
That's a great question. So the only surviving silver objects that I've been able to find are really the ones in Robert Barker's collection. So that's kind of the case study that I have to work with. I haven't found any physical objects that survive that do give us that concrete evidence, but I mean, enslaved peoples were creative in reworking silver and metalsmith. I think that's just a fact, even if it's not recorded in the archive, that I think that is very likely a possibility that West African practices continued or reformed within the context of Jamaica, just being amongst different people from different African cultures and forming new ones. Yeah. Furniture, yeah.
This is from Brittany Luberda at Baltimore Museum. Excellent talk. Would you be able to speak further about the branding of enslaved people with a silversmith's hallmarking tool? I think were silversmiths selling branding marks, or were these made by blacksmiths?
Could you repeat the question? Sorry, I couldn't hear it up here.
She said, would you be able to speak further about the branding of enslaved people with a silversmith's hallmarking tool? Were silversmiths selling branding marks, or were these made by blacksmiths?
So I came across that reference to a branding mark in a probate inventory of Thomas Pitts. He's the enslaver of Phoeba, and in his inventory lists a silver stamp for enslaved peoples that is labeled with the initials TP. And so that is the extent of the information that I have at the moment. Do you know more, Lewis?
I'll just add just a little bit to that, and that is there's a surviving silver brand at Drayton Hall Plantation in South Carolina. And if you look at all runaway ads in Jamaica through the course of the 18th century, any runaway is consistently labeled. One of the indicators is where they are branded and what the brand is. So just as a basic assumption, we can assume that the vast majority of enslaved people are branded in 18th century Jamaica. Mm-hmm.
I think Eleni can confirm, but I think when I was looking in the goldsmith records in the library that there's something about being branded with the date letter with the hallmark.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, in which case, I think we'll say thank you very much, Catherine, and well done. Lovely.